I'm John Kraft, the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities at Georgia Southern University. I wish to thank the Speaker Selection Committee for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful event. Thank you, Drs. Allison Belzer, Felicity Turner, Beth Howells, Mr. Paul Presley, and Ms. Kelly Applegate. It is my honor to welcome you all to the 2021 Mark Finlay Memorial Lecture featuring Professor Thomas Patterson. Allow me to tell you a little bit about Mark Finlay. He was a professor of history and an assistant dean of the College of Liberal Arts on the Armstrong campus. He was well published, and his last major work, a book entitled Growing American Rubber, won a National Book Award. He was undoubtedly one of the most well-respected faculty and administrators at our university. Mark was not only good at his job, he was courageous too. Mark died in an accident that left a sorrowful emptiness in many lives, but in particular for his widow, Kelly Applegate, and his two sons, Ellis and Grayson. I'm grateful for Kelly, who, with the help of other donors, created the Mark Finlay Memorial Lecture Endowment to support bringing in speakers who challenge us to create a better world by being thoughtful and courageous, just like Mark. And that brings us to our speaker, Dr. Thomas E. Patterson, Bradley Professor of Government and the Press at the Harvard Kennedy School. His first book, the award-winning Unseeing Eye, disputed the conventional wisdom on how television impacted the 1972 presidential election. Dr. Patterson has been prolific ever since. The common threads of his many articles and books include elections, politics, media influence, and the American voter. Each of them capture the complex relationships between modern politics and mass communication. I welcome Dr. Thomas Patterson as the 2021 Mark Finlay Memorial Lecturer. And with that, I hand us off to our moderator for tonight's lecture, Dr. Jared Yates Sexton. Dr. Sexton is a Georgia Southern Associate Professor of Writing and Linguistics, and his most recent book is American Rule: How a Nation Conquered the World but Failed Its People. Dr. Sexton, you're now in charge.
Thank you, Dr. Kraft. It is my sincere honor to be your moderator this evening. Before I introduce Dr. Patterson, I just want to remind everybody that after Dr. Patterson has concluded his presentation, we will be discussing the information given, and we will be watching your comments and your questions, and we'll incorporate those and have Dr. Patterson answer some of your thoughts and questions. Really quickly, bio on the exceptional Dr. Patterson. Bradley Professor of Government and Press at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He is the author of the recently published How America Lost Its Mind, which looks at the problem of misinformation. Earlier books include Out of Order, which examined the media's political role and received the American Political Science Association's Graeber Award as the best book of the decade in political communication. Another is The Unseeing Eye, which looked at television's impact on politics and was named by the American Association for Public Opinion Research as one of the leading books on public opinion of the past century. A Minnesota native, he earned his PhD from the University of Minnesota, where he studied after serving in the U.S. Army Special Forces in Vietnam. Dr. Patterson's work has been rightfully lauded as reasoned, serious, important, and his approach as no holds barred, as he has honestly and tirelessly wrestled with our political systems, prevailing trends, and the influence of narrative and media on our political realities. We are incredibly lucky to have him, not just as Georgia Southern for this lecture, but as a culture trying to make sense of a continually and aggressively worsening, dangerous, and ludicrous political moment. I would go on, but we'd be much better served hearing what he has to say about these matters. So without further ado, it is my sincere honor to introduce Dr. Thomas Patterson.
Thank you, Jared, and thank you, John. It's just a delight to be with you, and it's an honor to be the Mark Finlay lecturer. I know what he meant to your campus, and I've had colleagues of the same kind, and they're priceless. And when you lose them to a tragedy, it seems to compound the loss. So I'm really humbled and honored to be with you this evening. Give me a minute here. I'm going to pull up my slide deck. I found out on Zoom I somehow can't operate without slides. So I prepared a slide deck for tonight's talk. So there's been a sharp rise in misinformation over the last 4 decades. And I mean sharp. And this gives you a sense of just how substantial has been the rise in misinformation. The idea that somehow we think that reality is one way, but it's actually a quite different way. This is a real problem for our democracy. It would be for any democracy. We can go back in time, and there were a lot of worries, when survey research was first conducted, to find out that a lot of Americans had very little information about politics and public affairs. And some people saw that as a crisis. But there's one thing about the uninformed. They know what they don't know. The misinformed are more difficult. They think they know, but they're wrong. And oftentimes they're willing to act on it. So take a look at these statements. How many of them do you agree with? I'll quickly read them. Donald Trump faked having COVID-19 in order to win sympathy votes. Joe Biden is mentally impaired. Dr. Anthony Fauci funded a lab in Wuhan to develop the coronavirus. If reelected, Donald Trump planned to eliminate Social Security and Medicare. Kamala Harris was not born in the United States. The CDC manipulated numbers to exaggerate number of dead from COVID. President Trump went to the hospital last year after suffering a stroke. Vote counting machines overcounted the Biden vote. Well, in fact, none of those are true, but each is believed by tens of millions of Americans. Nearly half of Americans believe that Donald Trump planned to cut Social Security and Medicare if he won a second term. Nearly that many thought that Joe Biden, mentally impaired. Even at the bottom, a quarter of Americans think that Kamala Harris is not a citizen or that Dr. Fauci funded Wuhan. So what do these two developments have in common? The assault on the Capitol on January 6th, and now we've passed that tragic threshold of more than 500,000 deaths from COVID. Well, both were fueled by misinformation. Millions of Americans refused to believe the facts, and that contributed to both developments. So in one survey, people were asked whether Trump lost the 2020 election because it was stolen from him. And as you can see, 3 out of 4 Trump voters think the election was stolen. And that underpinned much of what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, the idea that they were going to recover the stolen election. And then in another survey, people were asked, would it be safer if you wore a mask? A fourth said no. Another fourth, unsure. And that contributed to the number of deaths from COVID. The facts are pretty clear in both of these cases. So the results of every state were certified as accurate by the secretaries of state of those states, most of whom were Republican. There were 100 lawsuits challenging the election results. And those judges, many again Republican, dismissed those charges as not having a foundation in fact. And then we look at COVID, and we've got good studies about the effect of wearing a mask and social distancing. If you do both, it cuts the rate of transmission by a factor of 4. You know, COVID, in my view, is the biggest public health failure in our history. We should have been a world leader in this area. Per capita, we have the largest number of ICU units, number of hospital beds. We have technologically advanced medicine, and yet we rank 185th out of the world's 195 countries in terms of COVID deaths per capita. If we had the same death rate as Australia, we would have less than 13,000 deaths rather than the more than 500,000 that we do have. Now, there's some special circumstances in this country. We were never going to have that low of a death rate, but I do think we could have kept it below 100,000 if we had listened and if we had heeded and if we had followed the advice rather than the misinformation that was floating out there around how you protect yourself and others from COVID. This is a cost of misinformation. This is a quote from the conservative columnist David Brooks. Once a country tolerates dishonesty, then everything else falls apart. So let me talk now about the rise of information, how it got so bad. One of the factors that's involved here is party polarization. As you know, Republicans and Democrats have been pulling apart. The division has been widening ever since the 1980s. This gives you a little bit of a sense of that. What I have here is simply the average position of the Republican, the average position of the Democrat on a simple scale from left to right, conservative and liberal. And as you can see over time, Republicans and Democrats have gone further apart. There was a poll that the Pew Research Center did that asked Democrats what they think of Republicans. Democrats think Republicans are closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, unintelligent. That same poll asked Republicans what they think of Democrats. Republicans think Democrats are closed-minded, immoral, dishonest, unintelligent. That's a deep divide in this country. You know, if you think about what sustains a democracy, you need a good constitution, you need good institution, you need good laws, but democracies also rest on norms, tolerance, forbearance, the idea that if you're in power, you don't take power to its absolute limit, that there are rights and interests that the minority has. And yet increasingly those norms are being eroded because of party polarization. We ought to be looking at people in the other party as opponents or rivals, not as enemies. And yet, as you can see from this poll, many Republicans see Democrats as the enemy, and many Democrats see Republicans as the enemy. It cuts into our social life. Just to give you a sense of how deep the divide is, when I was a kid, and they were asking this question in polls, oftentimes what they'd ask about, would you object if your son or daughter wanted to marry someone of the other religious faith or of the other race? Well, when they asked that back then about party, almost no one objected. But today, when they ask that question, a lot of parents say they wouldn't want to see their son or daughter marry across party lines. And the evidence indicates they're not thinking or not kidding. Less than 10% of marriages now unite a Republican and a Democrat. And the reason polarization matters, you know, we all engage in what's called confirmation bias. There are hundreds of studies that show confirmation bias, and that's a psychological tendency. We all have it to look at information and to, when we take it in, to kind of fit it to our beliefs and biases. In other words, we're imposing some meaning on that information. And in politics, the filter through which we kind of selectively look at information, the way we kind of shape it, is through our partisanship, whether we're a Republican or a Democrat. And confirmation bias is always there, but it gets exaggerated by polarization. We're more likely to accept false claims that support our tribe, the Democratic tribe or the Republican tribe. Let me go back to those factual questions I asked you earlier. All were false. So here they are again. But what I've done in this chart is to break down the responses into what Democrats said and what Republicans said. And as you can see, every negative thing about Republicans, from Trump faking COVID to having a stroke to cutting Social Security and Medicare, Democrats disproportionately are the Americans most likely to believe that. And then you look at the others, which are negative toward the Democratic Party, and in every case, it's the Republicans who are more likely to hold the false belief. And that's a cost of polarization. And democracy, I think, doesn't work when we divide ourselves into tribes, when we concoct realities that fit the reality of our tribe and demonize the other tribe. We treat each other as enemies. That's when democracy begins to weaken. And I think that's the state of American democracy at this moment. Now, there's another origin of our misinformation crisis that I want to talk a bit about. That's changes in our media system. So I grew up on this media system. It was the old media system. It was the media system of the daily newspaper and the three national networks, CBS, ABC, and NBC. And if you wanted to get national news, that's where you got it. And at 6:30 in the evening, 5:30 in some parts of the country, the only thing that was on television was the network evening news. And you had three choices. You could watch ABC, NBC, or CBS. And that old system had some real advantages to it. One thing it did, it created what scholars have called an information commons, that the messages that you were getting on those three networks and from your local newspaper, at least regarding national news, was pretty much the same. We were all kind of feeding off the same information flow. We were hearing and seeing and reading much the same thing. We didn't all make the same inferences from what we saw, but at least we had a common starting point. We also found during that period of time that information levels in the public were slowly rising, mainly due to the introduction of television. There were many newspaper readers. They were well informed, but some people didn't read the newspaper. But then television comes along, starts doing news with pictures. It begins to attract an ever larger audience, including some people who were not newspaper readers. We were enlarging the news audience, and the level of public information was on the rise. That was another benefit. And then it was depolarizing, and there's some good studies of this. We were hearing about both sides. We were hearing the good and bad about the Republicans, the good and bad about the Democrats. Actually, that brought Americans closer together. They began to see that they had more in common than they might have thought. So that was a depolarizing effect. Well, that was the old system. That's not the system we have today. That system began to come apart starting in 1980. 1980 was really when cable became a large part of American life. This is when CNN got started, and HBO and ESPN. And suddenly at the dinner hour, rather than just having a choice between three networks and watching the news, Americans had other choices. They could watch a movie, they could watch sports, and the like. And you can see just how rapidly cable penetrated American households. It took only a decade for it to get to half of the households, 80% in 2 decades, and it's gone up since then. Americans have a lot of choices because of cable. And the effect of cable was to some degree diminish the number of people who were following the news, the percentage of adults. If you look at the long historical trend, what history tells us about the public information system is that it got wider and wider and wider. More and more people got brought into it. Partly that was the growth in public education. Partly that was technological developments like the high-speed printing press that enabled newspapers to be printed more cheaply and therefore within the reach of more people. In the 1920s, radio comes along. That's another source of public information. In the 1950s, television comes along. We're on this ever upward kind of trek, becoming more informed, more engaged in public affairs. Then cable comes along, and some people desert the news. They go instead for the movies and the sports and the like. And then also, and this happened in 1987, was the elimination of the Fairness Doctrine. If you had a broadcast license before 1987, you had to treat the opposing sides fairly under the Fairness Doctrine. And what that meant is, in terms of partisan talk shows, that if you were a station owner and you had a conservative talk show in primetime on your station, you also had to have a liberal talk show in primetime on your station. And a lot of station owners weren't interested in doing that. They only wanted to kind of play to their side of the political aisle. So there weren't very many partisan talk shows. But then in 1987, they eliminated the fairness doctrine, and station owners had the freedom to air whatever they wanted to on their stations. And that's where we got political talk in great numbers. And you can see just how quickly that audience rose from very small numbers to, by 2000, more than 40 million weekly listeners to talk, political talk shows like Rush Limbaugh and the like. Then Fox News enters the scene. This happened in 1996. CNN was out there first in 1980 and kind of had the playing field all to itself for 16 years. But then Rupert Murdoch said, well, I think I want to start up a conservative alternative. He starts Fox News and he hires Roger Ailes, a longtime Republican political consultant, to run it. That begins to split the audience. Now we start to divide the audience, not only by those who are interested and not interested in news, but Democrats and Republicans start going to different sources. Now, it always takes a while for audiences to figure out kind of what an outlet is all about. So it wasn't like overnight in 1996, all the Republicans flocked to Fox to get their information. But what you can see is over time, this increasingly became a network that was catering to Republicans, and Democrats were dropping out of that audience. And that trend has continued. It's now about 4-1 Republican over Democratic on Fox News. And then, you know, money hates a vacuum, and there was money to be made with the liberal alternative, and MSNBC was struggling, trying to be a kind of a straight up cable news channel. So it decided it was going to become the liberal alternative to Fox. And it made that decision in the early 2000s. And before long, that became the Democratic network, with Democrats flocking to MSNBC and Republicans leaving MSNBC. Again, partisan sorting in where we're getting our information. Then the internet gets added to this mix. So it was in the 1990s, basically, that the internet was open to average citizens. Before that, had been largely dominated by the military. That was the way the internet got started, but it was opened up to the citizenry. And we got the email and the platforms and the social media and all of that. But how do people use it? So this is a question about when you see a political posting on the internet that you disagree with, what do you do? Well, we don't act like citizens. We don't say, well, let's discuss this, let's engage, let's talk. We either ignore it or we attack it. Partisanship comes into play. And these are echo chambers now. So Americans, when they go to social media, tend strongly to interact with people who think like they do. And if you go to a blog or a website that's a political blog or website, there are very few in the middle. There are very few that try to kind of strike a moderate tone. They're either on the left or on the right. And if you're in kind of that circle and someone from the outside comes in who doesn't share your views, you have all sorts of way to kind of telling them to go away. They're not really wanted here. And then if you look at blogs and websites and the links, who do they link to? Not to neutral sources, not to sources on the other side of the political fence, but to sources that basically cater to the same audience. These are echo chambers. So why does this matter so much? Where does this play into misinformation? Well, partisan media, and when you think about partisan talk shows, websites, blogs, studies show that these are filled with misinformation. That's part of their model, is to engage in spin, to make their side look better than it is, to make the other side look worse than it is. There was a nice study that was done of 4 million media messages. This is an exhaustive study, and across a variety of media, including partisan media. And they found partisan media to be distinctive. And distinctive in what way? Well, distinctive for its disinformation, for its lies, for its half-truths. Rush Limbaugh was one of those individuals who poo-pooed the wearing of masks and social distancing, saying repeatedly on his program, "COVID is no worse than the common cold, folks." That's a quote from Rush Limbaugh. It is worse. It's more than 10 times worse than a common cold. It's more likely to kill you by far. Social media. This is a mess. When the internet came along, we thought, oh, this is going to be great. No longer this top-down communication where the networks tell us about things, newspapers tell us about things. We're going to be part of the conversation. This is going to be two-way communication about public affairs. This is going to be the flowering of a new age of democracy. Well, it hasn't quite worked that way. It's populated in part by foreign actors. Russia's been very active on American social media. Russia has a troll farm, 1,000 people work in it. Their task is every day to tweet 50 tweets, send it to America, and try to disrupt American democracy, make Americans not like each other. Now, if it was just Russia, we could handle it, but Americans are even more prominent in terms of spewing misinformation on social media. And then we, the users, we're more likely to share false information, in part because the claims are just sensational. They get our attention. Oh, I got to share this with my friends. I mean, this is from the 2016 campaign, fake news. Pope Francis shocks the world, endorses Donald Trump for president. Millions of people saw this bit of fake news. Popes don't endorse presidential candidates, never have, I assume never will, but it got a lot of traction. There was a nice study that was done about just how fast fake travels versus real. So real stories, actual stories on the internet travel at only 1/6 the speed of fake. And again, it's because fake is so compelling and sensational and the like that we grab onto it. We send it to our friends. We're the transmitters. We're part of the problem. And contributing to this problem is the fact that we've gone away from the reliable news sources. I showed you earlier in 1980, the network news audience was 55 million. Now it's 22 million. Newspaper circulation was over 60 million. Now it's only 26 million. That's daily. If you have accurate information, if you know the facts, that actually is a very good counter to misinformation. But if you don't know the facts, you don't have a counter to misinformation. You're liable to become prey to it. And the other thing is that our reliable sources, our traditional media, are not as reliable as they once were. Now, I'm not saying that they deliberately twist the facts. They try to be objective, but they report the words of political leaders who in fact do shed the truth. And what we've found in studies is that a lot of the misinformation comes through the mainstream media. And it comes through the media by virtue of their quoting newsmakers who are not telling you the truth. And I do think we have a problem of truth at the top. That's not new to government. We've always had that problem. If you go back to the Vietnam era and the Pentagon Papers, which revealed that the Johnson administration had not been candid with the American public about the progress of the war in Vietnam. It had been painting a rosy picture, where in fact, it was a troubling picture about the progress of the war. So it's not new, but I think that it's on a level that we've never seen before in this country. And one reason for that is that the norm against lying really has weakened, and it's almost endemic now at the highest levels of our politics. And what the studies show is when our political leaders lie to us, when they're the source of misinformation, that's when we're most likely to believe it, because they're in positions of authority, they're in positions of trust, and they're letting us down. So here's an example of how journalists contribute to the spread of misinformation. So A fact check found that a third of Donald Trump's tweets, when he was still able to tweet, contained a false claim. So I have a question for you. What percentage of Trump's tweets were known to the public because they heard it directly or indirectly through a news source, as opposed to seeing it directly on his Twitter feed? The answer is 99%. 1% of Americans were getting Trump's tweets directly from him. The rest of us were getting it directly or indirectly through the media. That's what I mean by talking about the media as a megaphone for the misinformation that's being provided to us by our newsmakers. So how do we fix this problem? So we could hold political leaders to account for lying, but the problem is we don't detect it. When the leaders on our side of the partisan divide are lying, we detect it on the other side. And even when we do detect it, we don't value truth enough to base our vote on it. I can't think of more than one or two politicians who might have lost public office because they engaged repeatedly in misinforming the voters. Now, we could get our information from reliable sources. That would help. But increasingly, we kind of prefer sources that tell us what we'd like to believe. We really want to be kind of patted on the back that we've got it right and the other side got it wrong. And we could hold ourselves to a higher standard. So the problem with that is confirmation bias, which I talked about earlier, is ingrained. Everyone, to some degree, engages in confirmation bias. And the problem with that is we don't often know when we're wrong. And we have a tendency to deflect conflicting information. We have really kind of strong psychological defenses when it comes to protecting what we believe and getting rid of things that contradict those ideas. So if those don't work very all that well, how can we do it? So I think we've got to demand that our traditional news outlets, social media platforms like Facebook, do more to stop it. One way to stop misinformation is to get it early, before it goes viral, before it really starts to spread. And at my center at Harvard, we've got 12 people who are working with news organizations and with the platforms like Facebook to try to figure out how to do a better job of stopping this stuff before it really spreads, because it's really hard to pull it back. It's almost impossible. Once a bad idea gets into people's minds, it's almost impossible to get them to change their minds. You got to get it early. You got to stop it before it's out there. Now, the other thing that will break the hold, or at least historically will break the hold, is if one of our parties becomes much stronger than the other. If you look at history, the tendency of parties to mischaracterize each other has been greatest when the parties have really been closely competitive. That's also the point where the polarization has been the greatest, because the parties are focused on the next election. They think, well, I can win the next election and then I'll have power. And the way that I do that is do everything I can to damage the opposing party. What happens when you have a stronger party, when one party is clearly more powerful than the other, that incentive begins to diminish greatly. The stronger party really doesn't have a reason to demonize the weaker party. It's going to win the next election anyway. And the weaker party, if you think about it, if it demonizes the stronger party, it's going to weaken its chances of trying to pull some of those people away, because it needs to pull some of those people away to become more competitive. This is the pattern that we saw after World War II, where the Republicans had initially been strident opponents of the New Deal. But in the 1950s, largely in great part because of the leadership of Republican President Dwight Eisenhower, they moved much closer to the Democratic Party, embraced things like Social Security and the minimum wage and so on. And there was a depolarization that was going on. And the depolarization was really around the fact that one of our parties was stronger than the other. And the two parties then had less reason to really spend all of their time hammering away at each other. I think that probably is going to be the answer. I'm not going to tell you which party I think is likely to be the one that will pull away, but I think we're probably not going to get out of this mess until, or at least if history is a guide, we won't get out of this mess until that happens. So thank you for listening, and questions, comments. I always like opposing opinions, so feel free to kind of fire away at me. And I think Jared is going to moderate this. And Jared, I hope you'll join me. You've written about many of these things yourself, so please kind of jump in with your thoughts as well.
Well, I was sitting here, I was really happy that you brought up Ailes and Fox News coming about in 1996. And when I was doing research on my last book, I came across the press conference that Ailes gave with Rupert Murdoch when they announced Fox News launching. And this quote has always sort of stuck with me. He said, somewhere between 56 and 82% of American people think news is biased, negative, and boring. So let's take 60%. It looks like a marketing niche to me. And of course, Fox News found its marketing niche. It provided a pretty glaringly conservative, right-wing version of the news. But in the past couple of years, and I know that you know this, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it, it turns out that marketing niches and openings for alternatives doesn't just go one way. And we're actually watching with Fox News, a lot of Republicans, Trump supporters, conservatives have actually even started leaving Fox News for alternatives like Newsmax, OANN, independent media, people who believe maybe more conspiratorial ideas or maybe alternative facts the Republican Party still holds to. How do you see that opening and those marketing niches affecting the current climate?
Oh, that's a good question. And, and you're quite right, Jared. I mean, one of the things about the current media system is that the threshold for entry is much lower than it was back in the age of the newspaper. A.G. Liebling, really remarkable journalist, remarked that freedom of the press belongs to those who own a newspaper, right? That it was hard to get in. It's much easier to get in now. And you look at something like the growth of Newsmax, how quickly its audience grew, or how quickly Fox's grew. It took 4 years, but that's not a very long period of time. Fox passed CNN as the top ranked cable news network. So and that was 4 years after it came online. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is that there's more room for competitors. But to me, one of the most interesting things is what happens to the older player in that situation. So there's a nice study that was done of the 2016 election where Breitbart News was pulling audience away from Fox. So how did Fox respond to that? It moved closer to Breitbart. I think we know what's been happening in the last 2 months or so. It's moving closer to Newsmax and the like. I mean, it's moving further to the right because that's where the audience is. And I think that's sometimes underestimated by people, the degree to which this combination of market forces and political forces really commingle. And to some degree, I think to the disadvantage, the same thing I think can happen with MSNBC. So this is not a right or left thing. This is a question of if you're in the ratings business, you go for where the audience is. And if the audience is moving right and moving away from you because there's a further right alternative, you're going to chase it. And that, of course, just increases the polarization.
Well, I thought it was very interesting at the events of January 6th that so many of the people who broke into the Capitol were streaming to their own viewers and asking for donations from them. And you actually have a lot of people who turned their attempted coup of an election into an amazing fundraising opportunity for themselves because they were independent, streamers or personalities or whatever. And in a way, a lot of those people were able to grow their own information networks, spheres, and influence because they attempted to overthrow a democratically elected president.
Right. Yeah, and little did they know they probably were increasing their chance of being indicted. So
I think we saw that.
They left a big trail of evidence behind. So we've got a mess. I mean, I think the assault on the Capitol is really, first of all, this should never have happened. And the only other time was with a foreign invasion. These were Americans that invaded our capital, and they were fueled by misinformation. I don't have any doubt that they sincerely believe that the election had been stolen. I mean, I don't think that 90% of them thought we're just going to do this because we can hijack this election, even though that we know that Biden actually won the thing. I think they bought into the big lie about the stolen election. But misinformation can be really powerful. It can move a mob. And then you take the COVID example and that human tragedy that we've been going through. It should have been, it was always going to be a human tragedy. But on this scale, in this country, to be honest with you, it's almost unbelievable to me that that could happen in America, but it did. And misinformation was such a large part of the tragedy.
Yeah, I think it's really terrifying and sobering, not only what happened with COVID, which feels, I mean, personally, I hope it's the high watermark of the damage that misinformation can do. I hope that we can look at it and move away from it and be better. But I mean, we've seen it before with radicalization. We've seen it with domestic terrorism. Misinformation encouraged and inspired things like the Oklahoma City bombing. I mean, it's a really disturbing possibility, I think, that we're looking at. I want to bring in a couple of questions, and because I work in the College of Arts and Humanities, I'm really happy to ask this one, which is John Taylor brought up the possibility that education might provide an alternative. The possibility, and as a professor of writing, I always like to think about critical thinking and examination of sources and such. How do you feel education could possibly curb this problem or help contribute to a solution?
No, I think it can help. Albert Einstein, when he was asked about the purpose of a college education, he said, it's really not so much about the learning of facts. It's really about the learning how to think, right? And I think critical thinking, if it was applied in many of these situations, would disabuse people of some of the notions that are held. Let's take an example from the 2016 campaign. So Donald Trump won the Electoral College vote, lost the popular vote, and claimed that the reason that he lost the popular vote was that roughly 5 million undocumented immigrants voted in the election. Now think about that for a minute. So you're undocumented. Let's apply some critical thinking here. You spend your life trying to stay out of the crosshairs of authorities. The idea that 5 million of them would show up at polls, or they check IDs, or there's a Republican poll watcher and a Democratic poll watcher. Many of these polls, there'll be a police officer there. I mean, the idea that, it's so absurd once you start to kind of peel back the veneer. And with almost all of these things, that's the case. If we could get people to kind of just reflect for a little bit. Now, I'm not a fan, on the other hand, of media literacy as a cure. Any more than I think that civics education in the high school is going to automatically make good citizens. One of the problems is not that those aren't well-intentioned. They don't have some effect, but the distance between being, a high school junior or a sophomore or a senior, and then being a 35-year-old citizen, there's a long path there, and there's a long distance between the two. And I don't know why we would expect a civics lesson to last any longer than we might a math lesson or something of that kind, right? So, but I do think critical thinking, which we can do as instructors in all of our courses to build that capacity, that cuts across disciplines, that cuts across elements of life. It's a lifelong skill, and it's a really powerful skill, and it can be applied in politics and virtually every other aspect of our daily lives.
I'm going to get to a couple questions. I wanted to ask you very, very quickly in terms of the undermining of science and experts and where you see a lot of this coming from. I know there are a lot of political and economic reasons why there have been shots taken at scientists. I know a lot of it includes things like climate change and its place in the political discourse. As professors and members of a college community, I think that we take a lot of shelling for our placement in the middle of this political debate and jostling about. I was hoping you could talk about a little bit about how the history of that has occurred and maybe some of the motivations that have played out.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, Jared. I think you're a better historian from your work than I am, but you know, there's always been this kind of anti-intellectual current, part of American life, and you know, I think it goes back to that sense of self-reliance. We're all equal. You make it on your own, and so we've never kind of placed a premium on the intellect, let's say, that many of the continental European countries did. So in some ways, it was kind of a soft beginning, right? So there was the seedbed that would allow these attacks on science to get more traction here than you would in some other Western societies. And then some of this was quite deliberate. After the Kyoto Agreement was signed, and that was a flawed agreement, and I understand why many Republicans were opposed to it. It included put burden only on developed countries and let developing countries like India and China off the hook. So there were plenty of reasons to object to that. But corporations understood that if something was going to be done substantial about climate change and soon, they were going to pay a cost for that. And you got a real sustained large campaign to delegitimize the science, to call it into question. And some of those corporations now have apologized for being part of that disinformation campaign. You know, but it cost us years, and we're still trying to catch up. So I think a lot of it's been quite deliberate. It's been designed, as politics often is, toward an end, and we'll use whatever means we have to get to that end. I mean, sadly, that's sometimes the story of our politics. You'd like to think in a democratic society that the means don't justify the end in every case, but when you have extreme polarization, when you have what people say are extraordinary stakes, who's in power and who's not, a lot of the barriers come down.
I'm glad that you mentioned the beginnings of this country and our legacy. I happen to get a lot of enjoyment out of people who are behaving as if conspiracy theories in America are new, and that we weren't settled by, you know, colonizers who came over because of conspiracy theories, and it wasn't the Illuminati didn't play, you know, part in our, you know, political discourse for a while. It's
yeah, no, you got a great book on myths.
It's
American
really
myths, right?
I mean, all of a sudden, QAnon starts looking pretty tame, you know? Right. Okay, so Jim Bronner asked an interesting question. I wanted to hear from you on this, because this felt a little bit like a sea change to me after the big lie and conspiracy theory, the Stop the Steal movement, all of these allegations about Dominion voting machines and how this corporation that helped run the 2020 election was basically an agent of Venezuela and every other left-leaning country in the world. But we've actually seen Dominion start to strike back against people who published and pushed this conspiracy theory. We're watching people like OANN and Newsmax, and even Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, like getting charged with billion-dollar lawsuits about the slandering of their reputation. Do you see that people who are being slandered with things like misinformation taking legal recourse? Do you see this making a dent in it, or do you see this as maybe a momentary thing?
Well, we'll see. I mean, we'll see what kind of progress they have with some of these lawsuits. When you're dealing in the public space, our laws really bend over backward toward free speech, and at least when it comes to lawsuits, right, in terms of getting judgments from a court. So we'll just see whether they're able to do it. But I do think the stolen election idea is again one of those things where people have just stepped back for a little bit and kind of lowered their guard and listened. You think about how we do elections in this country. They are really decentralized. This is one of the hardest countries in the world to rig an election, right? Because it goes down all the way to the precinct level, right? And at the precinct level, you got one Republican poll watcher there and one Democratic poll watcher there, and people are logged in and they cast their ballots. And in many places, they do it electronically and paper. They can be double checked. And then they get aggregated up to the state level, right? But it's still, that's the unit, right? If you're going to rig this election, you got to do it at the local level, and not only local, but neighborhood, right? And it's just almost impossible to think how you would do the American. The biggest problem we have with fraud in this country is not with the voters. The biggest problem is tend to be people who are at the top who, figure out ways to keep people from voting and things of that kind, right? This idea that, you talk to office holders, everyone says, well, get out to vote. It's your duty. We want you to vote. Well, a lot of them aren't telling you the truth. A lot of them would hope you don't show up at the polls. And the smaller the electorate, generally the better for those in power. And some of them work at shrinking the electorate, not expanding it. So, but that's where we are in our politics.
Well, I think we have time for one more question, and I'm really, really curious to what you have to say about this. You brought up social media, and I think one of the bigger problems of our time is that social media makes its money by keeping people addicted to its platforms, keeping them in echo chambers. The algorithms are set up explicitly to keep people going further and further into their own echo chambers. We even have people from Facebook and Twitter who are telling regulators and legislators, please make us stop. We can't stop. This is our profit motive. Right. And obviously there's a lot of talk about that from a grassroots level or from a citizenry level. Meanwhile, a lot of politicians happen to work with these social media companies, and they happen to depend on them for their campaigns and donations to their campaigns. Do you see this shifting in some point in the future? Because it feels like this is going to be, if there's going to be a change here, if there's going to be something better here, do you see legislators and reformers actually making them somehow or another step away from misinformation? Because it seems like it's impossible for them to do it on their own.
So I think there's a couple of different issues in there. Let me just speak a little bit to the addictive quality of social media. I mean, this is kind of the Skinner's box thing. I mean, if you know that experiment where, you give someone a nice little incentive and do it often enough, and they start looking for it all the time. And, the studies that have been done is, if you look at this, track this over about 15 years or so, just how many more tweets people who tweet send today than they did when they first had the chance to do this. It's really addictive. So, we're part of the problem. The thing about platforms, to me, that's a really complicated issue, actually. I'd like to see some breakup, and I would like to see some of the really powerful platforms here not be allowed to do some of the things that they do. It would have been better if Facebook had not been allowed to acquire Instagram, for example, and so on. to have more competition. But I worry a little bit about competition too. When we fragmented cable, when we fragment the internet, we think, oh, that's going to be a good deal, right? But look what those developments brought us, right? A misinformation swamp is what we got out of that fragmentation. So sometimes consolidation, like it was when there were 3 networks, and that's where you got your news, or in your local community, there was one newspaper, but it was strong and it was an important source of news. So almost everyone took it, and therefore it was economically viable. Sometimes near monopolies actually can be fairly valuable in the information sphere. So I think this is going to be a real challenge for the regulators to kind of get this right. But I think they have to make some adjustments. I do think there's too much power in the platforms, and not very much accountability. That they're accountable only to themselves. And in a democratic society, ultimately that doesn't work. We need every, and you can make that complaint also, by the way, about the news media. I know you're sometimes critical of the news media, as am I. They're self-regulating, but they don't always do a good job of regulating themselves, right? And sometimes you need someone to come in and slap them around a little bit. And I think with the platforms, we need more regulation, but we got to be a little careful that we don't end up with chaos.
Well, I just want to say really quickly, a lot of what we're talking about here are larger forces than ourselves, and in very, very large gears that we can't necessarily, put our shoulders into. But I really appreciated what you said and what you just reiterated, which is we have a choice as well of how we interact with these things, what we share on social media, how we interact with politics, making better choices. And I think that is, I think that's something that we all need to remember, is that these forces and things are very, very large, but we can also change things on a personal level.
That's a good place to stop. Great.
I mean, it could go down a very bad rabbit hole otherwise. I think that's
no. I mean, I think personal responsibility. I mean, we get so mired in talking about failures of our institutions and our leadership, but a lot of that, the weakening of the norms is on us. We've become less tolerant. We've been more accepting when our side takes the law to the limits and maybe even beyond. So, look in the mirror. We're part of the problem, and we need all to be part of the solution.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Tom Patterson. I'm sure everybody who's watching, and thank you so much for watching. This was an incredible event, and we are just so grateful to have had you. A quick couple of thanks to Dr. Kraft. Thank you so much. Allison Besler, who has been handling the nuts and bolts and buttons and just fantastic stuff. And of course, the College of Arts and Humanities. You are wonderful. So, so wonderful. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you so much.